From the heart of Maine, this is the DuView Podcast.
All right, and welcome to this week's episode of the DuView Podcast. I am your host, Du, a.k.a. Ryan Dumont, and this week I am continuing with my feature on Maine's highest peak, Mount Katahdin. So this is going to be Mount Katahdin Part 2 today, guys, and so I'm going to go ahead and kind of put out a spoiler warning / stop everybody here. If you haven't listened to Katahdin Part 1, Mount Katahdin Part 1, stop right now and scroll down a couple slides here in the directory where you listen to this episode, and start with the first one. It really is consequential to the whole story, so it's important that you hear the full bore here, the full experience. So go ahead and stop you there before getting into it. But that being said, for those of you who are caught up, congratulations. Thank you for listening. Greatly appreciate that. If you could do me a huge favor in the beginning of this episode, I know I said this at the end, but I'm going to say it at the beginning. If anybody listening could go ahead and leave a like or subscribe on YouTube or any of the basically type of things that give us a review or give us some a boost in the algorithm on social media. If anybody listening could do that, including the people who aren't caught up, I just wanted to, reward those or thank those. But that being said, guys who are caught up and people who aren't caught up, anybody who listens is a fan of the podcast, if you could please go ahead to either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, our Facebook page, and just give us, what you think, the type of quality of content I put out. If you think I do a great job, 5 stars is always appreciated. But if you don't, give an honest rating. So regardless, having a rating versus not having a rating helps the algorithm and helps me get this content and my podcast out to more people. And so I guess that's just kind of what I'm trying to do here, guys. I'm just trying to get out what I put out to more people other than just you religious folks or you folks, I should say, not you religious folks, but you folks who tune in religiously, rather. The fans, the people who have really grabbed onto it. And for those who have come and listened to every episode so far, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. But that being said, we're here to talk about Mount Katahdin Part 2 today, guys. Enough of me trying to pander for, rates and views and subscriptions. But that being said, we're going to be taking a look into the latter half of Mount Katahdin and basically some of the stuff that happened more recently in the last 100 years, more or less, or a little bit over, because I am going to start off with the late 1800s and really just kind of start off with, I know I mentioned this on the last episode, but, Teddy Roosevelt and his time in Maine, because it does have a pretty big impact, and it also happens to fall around the time that we are in now, so it's kind of funny how that happens, and so I'll get into that in just a minute. But last episode, Mount Katahdin Part 1, we met the forest or mountain spirit Pomola, and heard a little bit about Native American culture and how the mountain stood a significant role in their culture of Penobscot Native Americans, or Penobscot Indian tribe to be exact, up there. We also heard about some of the first Americans or Europeans or quote-unquote white folks to go and see Mount Katahdin and document it in land surveys, even before Maine became a state, By the 1800s, though, the area changed a little bit. Later 1800s, 1880s, 1870s, there's starting to see more of a population boom up in that area. Now, keep in mind that the American, and I kind of talked about this in my episodes on Augusta, Maine, the American frontier is an interesting component to this time period, because this is where we're starting off here is the 1870s, so post-American Civil War, but definitely during a large part of American expansionism. You had people on both coasts of the United States, but the areas in between were starting to get filled in a way. And so out west, obviously, you had, the cattle towns and, the cowboys and Wyatt Earp and Dodge City and all that type of stuff. But we also had a frontier, and I don't like using the word taming because it has a lot of negative connotations in a lot of ways, but and I'm going to use that for today's episode anyway. That they were also, while they were trying to tame the western frontier, they're also trying to tame the Maine woods. And even today, as much of technology that we have, the Maine woods and still wins out. And you guys get what I mean by that, is that at the end of the day, nature does still always win, guys. We forget that. as we think we are masters of the climate environment, and when in reality it is the master of us. So that being said, it's good to be mindful of our climate environment, and that's what a big part of Teddy Roosevelt's being. He is the man who created the national, along with John Muir and a few other folks. I could do a whole episode on the creation of the national park system and all that conservation efforts in the early 1900s with the progressive movement, but we see Roosevelt's time spent in the Maine woods and just in the outdoors in general, but just happened to be in Maine, has a huge impact on policies that he makes later on, and like the want and need to conserve nature. And so that ends up playing a pretty big role here in Teddy's own experience and also in the state of Maine. So we'll go into it, guys. Mount Katahdin Part 2, starting off with the adventures of Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt, at the age of 19, arrived the first week of September in 1878 on the porch of the Seawall House in Island Falls, Maine. And he met his host and guide for the next 2 weeks, a man by the name of Bill Sewall, age 33. Sewall stood about 6'4" and had been taking hunters into the Maine woods since he was 12. Roosevelt was a Harvard junior, asthmatic, and weak in body. But what he lacked in physical strength, he more than made up for in internal will over the next few visits that he had to the state of Maine. Together, the two men, one a young privileged New Yorker and the other a wood-hardened, trail-wise Maine guide and lumberman, joined on an outdoor adventure which they hiked many miles, hunted and fished for days, and eventually climbed Mount Katahdin. On the climb, Roosevelt had to wear a pair of light-soled deerskin moccasins that he intended to wear for slippers in camp along the way. He had lost one of his pairs of boots that he was planning to wear on the mountain when crossing the Wasatucket stream barefoot. So, interesting, we're really seeing the foundational stages of Teddy Roosevelt here, guys, and he is not the hardened badass that we see when he becomes president. This is Maine made, and I'll get into this a little bit later. I'm biased this way. Again, I love my state, and I think Maine is such a cool place and a special place, but Maine made Roosevelt in a lot of ways. He got toughened up, and he got his experience that he would use, again, later on in life. Being that tough badass comes out of being from the state of Maine. It isn't always easy, to say as great as Maine is as a place, it's not always an easy place to live. Like between the winters and everything like that, you have to be some type of hardened individual to live up here in the Northeast, and I'm not just saying that to toot my own horn, but you see that, and especially in the, in the 1800s where technology isn't quite there, you're still limited on what you have for heat sources, and electricity is still way off, so, indoor plumbing and all that. So that being said, it takes a hardy individual to be taking people like Bill Sewall did into the Maine woods as a 12-year-old, probably strapped up, able to kill bear, deer, moose, and everything else that he needed to do to survive. So it was just definitely interesting experience here for Teddy. And so, they climb Mount Katahdin. He loses his shoe in the stream and has to climb the mountain in moccasins, which again starts to add to his legendariness or his prowess, in the sense that he became a living legend in his own time. Really, again, we see all these stories surrounding Teddy Roosevelt, whether it be the invention of the teddy bear, and again that there are some liberties taken with some of these things, obviously, guys. But it's just like interesting to see what a role this state played on a future president. Later on, Teddy would grow up, obviously, and go on to a very successful political career and the early stages of the Progressive Republican Party, a lot different from the Republican Party of these days. But that being said, in August 27th of 1902, Teddy visited Bangor for a speech, and he invited Bill Sewall into his railroad car. That's actually how they used to campaign back in the day. They used to do what was called whistle stops. You'd go from major railhead to major railhead, station to station, and you'd give speeches literally on the back of a train. And this was a hugely important way for politicians, to connect with people all across the country. It was a very practical and successful way, and I think, honestly, frankly, it's pretty cool that you could just, pull up to the train station and hear, from potentially the next president of the United States in this, or the president of the United States in this situation. And so in Bangor, there was actually a report done, on Roosevelt's on his visit in 1902 in August. So this is a quote from the newspaper at the time. At Bangor, Maine, an old loyalty reawakened. Quote from Roosevelt: "If anyone sees or knows Bill Seawall of Island Falls, a rustic is," Roosevelt yelled from the balcony of the Bangor house. I wish he would. I wish I would tell him I want him to come in for lunch with me right now." The bewhiskered woodsman who had toughened him as a teenager came lazily through the crowd to the roar of applause. And so it was interesting, that he had such a demand and a way about him that he could, just kind of bring people to his side. And so Teddy Roosevelt's an interesting guy, and also, shows a lot of respect for his mentor in a lot of ways, Bill Sewall. And so, he ends up, meeting with Sewall, and this is kind of like their last major interaction because, as you know, at this point, Roosevelt is president, so he is, trying to drum up support for another term and whatever else. So he also visited James G. Blaine in 1902 on his tour of Maine, stopping in the Waterville area as well. James G. Blaine obviously having a huge role in Maine politics. The Blaine House, governor's mansion, is literally named after him in Augusta. So, but I guess what I'm getting at, guys, is that Teddy really kind of loved, or, Theodore Roosevelt really kind of loved Maine as much as anybody could, not being from here, being an outsider coming into the state. And he actually writes about it pretty extensively later on in his life. This next excerpt I'm going to be reading from comes from his writings in 1918 or later on in his life. Much older man, reflecting back on his time spent in Maine. Looking back quite fondly. And again, it's interesting to tie parallels between what he says and what Thoreau said in the last episode, really capturing the beauty of Aroostook County, Piscataquis County, and the northern part of the state, because it truly is unique and unlike anything else. If you haven't had an opportunity to go to specifically Mount Katahdin and the surrounding area of Baxter State Park, or Aroostook County and northern Maine in general, you definitely should. Sparsely populated, yes, but full of beautiful nature and wonderment, most definitely. So, Teddy said this in his own personal writings. Roosevelt stated, quote, "I owe a personal debt to Maine because of my association with certain staunch friends in Aroostook County, an association that helped me and benefited me throughout my life in more ways than one. It is more than 40 years ago that I went to Island Falls and stayed with the Sewall family. I repeated the visit 3 or 4 times. I made a couple of hunting trips in the fall with Bill Sewall and Wilmot Dow, and one in the winter where I spent 3 or 4 weeks in snowshoes with them, visiting a couple lumber camps. I was not a boy of any natural prowess, and for that, the very reason, the vigor, outdoor life was just what I needed," end quote. And Roosevelt also goes on to in a longer part. That just took a short excerpt because it's quite a long. The man is very long-winded in his writing, but he describes how beautiful Maine was, the glistening of the snow as you snowshoe from field to field or from woods to woods, and Roosevelt would have a lot of these, and this is an actual interesting spot you can go and visit up in the Island Falls area. They actually just did a feature about this recently on the local news station, Channel 6. So you could go find that, and will look for that as well. But they interviewed some folks from Island Falls. I'm pretty sure the selectman or the mayor or something like that up there. And the area that Roosevelt would have a lot of these, I guess you could call them almost outdoor religious experiences, where the majesty and the beauty, along with his own religious beliefs, came into play. And there's actually Bible Point, state historic site, up in the middle of the Maine woods, where it is believed Roosevelt would spend time with a Bible, just using the Cathedral of the Pines, in a sense, as his place to practice religion. And so it's interesting, to tie a parallel to my own life. In 2020, campaigning for Governor Weld, who in a lot of ways is a similar type of Republican to Roosevelt, in the sense that they're, less, they're a little bit less conservative in certain aspects. But that being said, they both had a love of the outdoors, both came from New York City, and it was interesting to tie a lot of parallels. And again, grew up 100 years apart from each other. But interesting to see, working with someone who literally didn't describe himself as the most religious person everywhere, but said he felt like he was amongst a higher power when in the woods. So that, that's what I'm kind of getting at here, guys, is that, the woods, and this is in, between New Hampshire and the Adirondacks for, I guess, for Bill. But that being said, for Teddy, in this case, it was the Maine woods that was his sanctuary, so to speak, here. So again, Teddy would go on to become president, and basically his time in Maine would be a very formative experience, and basically, I guess in a sense, kind of prepare him for his adult life. So, he came to Maine for basically life boot camp in a lot of ways, and it, helped with his sickness and everything else, and he ended up going on to be, in my opinion, one of our best presidents. Again, no one is perfect, but as far as, looking out for the common man and doing things to secure the most good for the populace, God damn it, Teddy Roosevelt, you did it well. So that being said, guys, we're going to move on to the next part of this episode, Mount Katahdin Part 2, talk more specifically about the Katahdin area. And, well, Mount Katahdin resides in Baxter State Park. And it's really, the story of Baxter State Park is really cool, guys, because as I just talked about extensively with Teddy, one man's love of the Maine wilderness, well, we truly see one Mainer's love for the Maine wilderness and wanting to make sure that it stayed protected. If you remember from the end of episode 1, while there are a lot of woodsmen and hunters and such up there, a lot of this land that Mount Katahdin is surrounded by is owned privately at this time in the 1800s and 1900s by paper companies, by logging companies with the intent to clear-cut log and, make money off the land by cutting down trees. And so this ends up coming into play and really is why, this one man, of the name of Baxter, which the park gets its name from, basically why he did what he did. And so the next part of this episode, guys, we're going to really unpack the creation of Baxter State Park and the man who founded it, Percival Baxter. So a lot of my research into the creation of Baxter State Park, and specifically Percival Baxter himself, comes from an article by author Kat Ignatova. So that's where my research comes from, just to credit her for a lot of the information you guys are going to hear. But the interesting thing is about Baxter State Park, guys, it's not often that you can point to a single person and say, this guy gets all the credit for making this state park, national park, whatever. However, in this case, one person can say that, and that one guy, as I said, was the man by the name of Percival Baxter. He was the man that single-handedly created the legendary Baxter State Park. Percival Baxter's story begins on November 22nd, 1876, when he was born in Portland, Maine. His father, James Finney Baxter, was the founder of the Portland Packaging Company, a business that was a staple in the economy of Maine. And as a result of this, Baxter was born into a great deal of wealth, which would obviously come into play later. James Baxter used much of his money for philanthropic purposes, such as the founding of the Portland Public Library, serving as the president of the Maine Historical Society, and founding the Portland Society of Art, to top off his laundry list of achievements. He also served 6 terms as the mayor of the city of Portland. It's easy to see the influence, obviously, of James Baxter and that he had on his son's worldview, being his father. Not only did he emphasize the importance of education and public service, but he also installed in the young Percival an adoration and love of the Maine outdoors. James Baxter also loved to hike and fish and would often take his son on camping trips to the Maine woods. Percival Baxter graduated from Portland High School in 1894 and continued his education at Bowdoin College. He graduated with honors in 1898. 3 years later, he attained his law degree from Harvard University. Baxter never did pursue. He never was a litigator. He never really, practiced in court, choosing instead to return to Maine and work in the family business. But he's still holding a law degree, which is still impressive. During a fishing trip with his father in 1903, Baxter saw Mount Katahdin for the first time, and this set off a love relationship that would blossom in the years to come. Baxter eventually decided to follow in his father's footsteps, and in 1909 began a political career. He served in the Maine State Senate till 1910, the Maine House of Representatives from 1916 to 1919, and then again in the State Senate from 1919 to 1921. During his time in the House of Representatives, Baxter began his campaign for the creation of Mount Katahdin Park. He summited the mountain with a group of politicians, hiking up Knife's Edge to the highest knob known as Baxter Peak. In 1921, 2 major events occurred in Baxter's life. January, Baxter was elected as governor of Maine. In May, his father, James Baxter, died at the age of 90. The passing of his father spurred Baxter forward in his quest to create Mount Katahdin Park. In a speech given later that year, he spoke of his vision for the state park. Baxter said, quote, "Mount Katahdin Park will be the state's crowning glory, a worthy memorial to commemorate the end of the first and the beginning of the second century of Maine's statehood," end quote. Baxter ultimately failed in convincing the Maine legislature to purchase the area surrounding Mount Katahdin. So, what does a man with exceptional means do in his situation? Well, he says, fine, I'll do it myself. And he did. He ended up buying the park by himself. Much of the land around Katahdin was owned, as I mentioned previously, by the Great Northern Paper Company, and following the economic crash of 1929, they were more than willing to sell that land on the cheap. Baxter used his fortune he'd inherited from his father to purchase 6,000 acres around Mount Katahdin for $25,000, a little under the $360,000 in today's money. He immediately gifted the park to the people of Maine. In 1931, Mount Katahdin Park was created and named Baxter State Park. Baxter spent the rest of his life purchasing and adding land to the park. In honor of his father's memory and his love of the wildlife, Baxter added this codex or proviso to the deeds of the land. He added, quote, "This land shall forever be used for public park and recreational purpose, shall be forever left in the natural wild state, shall forever be kept as a sanctuary for wild beasts and birds, that no roads or ways for motor vehicles shall hereafter ever be constructed thereon or therein." So he wanted to keep this area pristine, natural, and the way it should be for people to enjoy, and also to keep the wildlife safe and healthy as well, to keep a good ecosystem and environment. Baxter held a great distrust towards the federal government, smart man, refused to allow Baxter State Park to become a national park. He added many strict provisions to his deeds that not even the Department of Conservation, which controls the other parks in Maine, had any authority over the running of Baxter State Park. A separate governing body, the Baxter State Park Authority, oversees the administration and maintenance of the park. Baxter died on June 12, 1969, and his ashes were scattered in the very park he helped create. He donated 28 deeds to Baxter State Park and left his $7 million fortune to be used for park maintenance. Baxter had never married. He had no children to inherit his wealth. Instead, he left behind a legacy to be remembered by the people of Maine and the Appalachian Trail hikers for years to come. Now, I'm going to pause for a minute because that's just so impressive. I'm not saying that if I ever became independently wealthy and had no family or anything, I would probably build a monument to the Maine woods, because I probably would. But that being said, that's love for the state. That's caring about. That man had cared. You know, like that's what I'm getting at, guys. It's that you don't see this in politicians today. You don't see this in our leadership today. Given, a lot of them are not independently wealthy before they get into office, but regardless of, personal wealth, that just shows that you care, regardless if you're loaded or not. He knew that there was something special in this state, and he had to protect it by any means. And again, took things into his own hands. It was his money. He didn't have to do that. He's one of those people that said, well, I have the means, so I'm going to do it. I care about, it's not like he's out here, I don't know, doing something stupid in, 1900, trying to build a death ray or something, because there was a bunch of, if you look at like the weird science and other stuff that was going on in the country at the time, there was a lot of weird stuff that people got duped to spending their money on. And so, to have somebody, say, this is, I need to create this monument to the Maine woods, this is important, to preserve, that's really impressive. And the fact that, Baxter could see that and then, took things into his own hands. And so now, this, in the modern day, the park is now a premier year-round destination for outdoor enthusiasts. Year-round staff of 22 swells to about 61 in the summer, including office and administration reservation personnel, field and law enforcement rangers, and resource specialists. Roughly 60,000 people visit the park in the summer months. Some stay for 10 nights, some visit only for the day. As visitation increases and the world becomes more complex, Park managers face new challenges daily that threaten to undermine the magnificent gift that Baxter left for all generations of Maine citizens to cherish. And so that becomes the big, the important caveat of this whole thing, right? And I've mentioned this before with other hiking and other natural monuments and such in, the state of Maine, like Acadia National Park is swamped now. Like, you have lines going up the side of some of the mountains I used to run up with no people. And so, you have to, I guess, adapt things in certain ways because you don't want to ruin things. And, the more people that go up the trails, the more things become eroded. But at the same time, those trails are there for people to enjoy. So it's a tough balance, really. It really is a tough balance. And so we see, in the modern day, that's the real challenge going forward, and obviously funding. But it's interesting, though, that Baxter State Park, unlike a lot of the other state parks, has its own, managerial body, and things were set up in a way to keep things Maine focused, and it's, I think Mr. Baxter rather understood that the federal government does do some things well, but they're not the end all be all solution to all of our problems. And if you think that government is, that's a huge misunderstanding because government does not do everything well. If you think it does, again, reconsider. But the focus to keep things, in-house and to keep things in-state is impressive to me in a lot of ways because, he cared about, like I said, he cared about the people of Maine, he cared about the state, and he wanted to make sure that the wilderness was there to be protected. And it is, and it's a fantastic spot. I mean, I know that there's, debate on access and this and that, and they created a national monument out there. Some people donated some land. It's like a national forest or something like that now. And people feel both ways on that. But it's at the end of the day, I think it all comes back to planning, folks. If you have good, city planning or, urban, I don't know, not even just urban planning, but planning for your towns and cities in general, you can kind of keep some areas nice and conserved and, natural in a lot of ways. And then areas that, are not like prime habitats and stuff like that, maybe you use for more habitation and other things like that. So it's just, that's what I think one of our biggest problems in this country is that we don't really plan things very well. I mean, you look at some of the most city planning that's gone into some of our cities, and it's like, oh, we made a grid system with our streets and stuff like that. And so it's just, and that's what I think is kind of cool about areas down in the southern part of the state where there are more people, is that they do have areas that have been gifted by families or whatever that have gone to different conservation groups, whether it be like down in the Augusta area, Kennebec Land Trust, or, any of those types of organizations, which are great too, which do a lot of good work in this state and in other states. But that being said, we are lucky enough to have one of the coolest, like I said, state parks in the country, being Katahdin. Or having Katahdin Baxter State Park. And again, we wouldn't have all this if it wasn't for, Percival Baxter. And, again, he was, as we see, and I guess this episode really kind of shows us when folks are installed with the right values. And again, you can debate what the right values are. That's fine. I'm just saying when folks are installed with what could be conceptualized as some of the right values, some good stuff happens. You see some real leadership in these two guys. By two guys, I mean Teddy Roosevelt and Percival Baxter, in the sense that, Maine and the outdoors was a huge formative part of their later lives, and it had a huge effect on what they did with their time and their passion and their money and everything, really, from their policies and their constituencies all the way down to their families and friends. Maine and the Maine Woods had a role in that and was maybe not on the front of their mind. I mean, more so in Baxter's mind, but not always in TR's, but it was always at least on the back of one of their minds. And so that being said, it shows that, when people put their minds to something, something happens, and it's really cool. I've always lived my life that way. If there's something that I think I can do, I'm going to go for it, and it's the same, fine, I'll do it myself. That I love that, I laughed, audibly, doing research for this episode and coming across that, that excerpt, saying, fine, I'll do it myself. You won't back me, Maine legislature. Fine. And that's, I think, a really unique approach. And I think really speaks to the resiliency of Mainers in a lot of ways. I think that, we are, like I said, you have to be a hardy individual to live up here, guys. It's not for the faint of heart. It's like, if you don't like the cold, if you don't like having 4 distinct seasons, you're not going to have a good time. It's just how it goes. And so it has a different effect on others. And, as we see, this is a really formative formative time for Roosevelt, his time spent in Maine, and as from his excerpts say, he looked back on it fondly, and many people look back on their trips to Maine fondly, and that's what makes this state so cool. Whether it be the Appalachian Trail hikers that climb Katahdin for the the tail end of their journey, and they feel so relieved once they get back down to the base, and leave Baxter State Park, because their multi-mile, million-mile journey, 1,000-mile journey is now finally over. And that's they can breathe a sigh of relief. So Katahdin really, like I said, it is the terminus for the Appalachian Trail, and like I said, I could do an episode just on the AT alone. And if you want to hear more about hiking Katahdin and stuff, go back and listen to my episode with Sean Zubrod. He's did the whole AT, good buddy of mine, and he really sums it up pretty well. And so go back and check out that episode. And I've also, to give more clarification, I've hiked Katahdin before. I've done it once. I did it back when I was in Scouts, and it was an experience. I have bad allergies to ragweed and stuff like that, and they stuck us right in a ragweed patch. So I had like an allergy attack basically going up the mountain and couldn't breathe. My sinuses and everything was like closing up on me, and it made it for a miserable time, but I made it to the top. I didn't do knife's edge or anything like that, and I would like to go back up and do that at some point, once I'm done dislocating my elbow or hurting myself or doing anything too crazy. So that being said, maybe we'll do a DuView podcast, Mount Katahdin weekend or something like that, and open it up, but that could be a good time. But that being said, guys, this does wrap up part 2 of Mount Katahdin. Like I said, another shorter episode here for you this week, just to break things up for you. Like I said, get caught up on both parts if you haven't. This is obviously part 2. And we just kind of looked at things, a little bit more modern, and the creation of the state park where, things sit and everything like that. So fun little series to do here, guys. Really enjoyed doing these solo episodes on specific topics. The research and everything's an enjoyable time. I just hope, you guys enjoy them, because that's really the big thing at the end of the day. I mean, I can get enjoyment out of it, but if you guys don't like it, what's the point in certain aspects? So that being said, guys, as I said at the beginning of the episode, if you guys could just drop a like or subscribe or give us a 5-star rating on any of our podcast platforms. That's the big thing right now, guys, is just getting the information out there to other people and just letting people know we're around. I'm still here, so I haven't gone anywhere yet, and really just want to get more people into the fold, and because like I said, I think I'm putting out the quality piece of content. The content's there, it's just we need some more ears. So that's where it falls onto you guys. Help me out here, please. Thank you. So that being said, guys, give this episode a share, like, subscribe, any of the stuff on YouTube, any of the stuff that helps me grow and get the word out there about the good old DuView podcast. And so it's been a joy, guys, and I hope you are all having a good summer, enjoying good Labor Day weekend and all that. Just to let you guys know, I will talk about this a little bit more. There are going to be no more episodes for the rest of September. I just am too busy, guys, to be completely honest with you, between dislocating my elbow and the COVID bit I had a few weeks ago and restarting school. I just need a little bit of time to get my feet back underneath me here and just retool a few things and get you guys, again, it's getting you guys the best content I can. And so if I don't feel I'm at a place where I can give you guys the best content, I'm just going to take a quick break, get my feet. And like I said, things have just been on screech, guys. I just got to get my feet back under me here real quick. And then we'll be back with guests in the studio here. So I am going to take the rest of September off. And I'll be back first week in October with a brand new episode of the DuView podcast. So like I said, take this time to get caught up, guys. We've got 32 episodes now after today. And so there's plenty of stuff that I'm sure you've missed one or, something along the way. So take an opportunity to get caught up. And so that being said, I'm not going to do, like I said, no new episodes for the rest of September. I'll be back first week in October with a brand new episode of the DuView podcast. So save the date, tell your friends. And just in the meantime, guys, like I said, if you could really help us out by giving us a rate or 5 stars, 4 stars, whatever, or a thumbs up or any of that type of stuff really helps. So greatly appreciate all you tuning in. Catch us on social media, the DuView podcast, DuView207 on Instagram. And other than that, guys, have a great rest of your month, and I'll see you guys back here at the beginning of October. Be well, be safe, and, enjoy your time together.